Peace hopes fade in the last hours before the deadline. Some Pentagon officials say Saddam may launch the first attack, and a Supreme Court ruling that may roll back school desegregation. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. Just a few hours left now before the deadline for Iraq to get out of Kuwait. Midnight Eastern U.S. time. Efforts are fading fast. All sides are girding for war in the Middle East. Tonight, UN Secretary General Paris de Cuellar issued one last appeal for Iraq to get out of Kuwait. Earlier, France gave up its diplomatic initiative. The French premier said, and I quote, "There is a fatal moment when one must act, and this moment, alas, has arrived." CBS News White House correspondent Wyatt Andrews begins our coverage. Wyatt?
Dan, the biggest question from here is whether there will be war at exactly the midnight deadline tonight. Now, the White House insists that the president, as of now, has not made any final orders, issued any final orders as to say specifically go or don't go. But at the same time, you get a resounding no comment here if you ask the question whether the president, in his own mind, has already decided that force must be used.
Early today, Mr. Bush convened his war council, including Secretaries Baker and Cheney, the vice president and top advisors, to discuss all diplomatic and military issues. But was there any diplomacy left to discuss? At the UN, the U.S. and Great Britain quashed France's idea of offering a conference in exchange for an Iraqi withdrawal, only to have French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas admit it was a moot point anyway. No one in Iraq was even listening.
The Iraqis are not leaving us any choice but war, unfortunately.
For whatever it's worth, tonight the UN Secretary General did issue one last appeal to Baghdad and suggested flexibility on Iraq's call for a comprehensive Mideast settlement.
I have every assurance, once again from the highest levels of government, that with the resolution of the present crisis, every effort will be made to address in a comprehensive manner the Arab-Israeli conflict, including the Palestinian question. I pledge my every effort to this end.
The mixed feelings within this country are reflected at the gates of the White House, with vigils and demonstrations now running around the clock. These voices of America ask the president to give peace more time. Official America answers that peace is up to Saddam.
Everyone is crying out for this man to come to his senses. This is within his grip and his hands to choose the path of peace.
As this deadline approaches, perhaps the clearest indication of the president's mindset is that he began this day by calling two clergymen and asking for their prayers. Dan?
Thanks, Wyatt. Officials at the U.S. Defense Department are watching the clock tick down. They are waiting for orders from President Bush. They are monitoring any indications that Saddam Hussein may open fire first. CBS News Defense Department correspondent David Martin is at the Pentagon this evening and has the latest. David?
Dan, there are some indications Saddam Hussein plans to strike first, launching an air or missile attack before the midnight deadline expires, or shortly after the midnight deadline expires. Other officials discount that possibility, but they all believe it is no longer a question of if war starts, but how and when. Defense Secretary Cheney seemed to capture the somber mood that has fallen over Washington.
It obviously is a moment of considerable gravity for anybody who's involved in government, whether it's the president or those of us in the Defense Department or the members of Congress.
This much is certain. Saddam Hussein shows absolutely no intention of pulling out of Kuwait. Not by midnight, not ever.
We don't see any evidence that they're in any way pulling out of Kuwait. Quite the contrary. From our last briefing, the number of forces, tanks, artillery pieces, and so forth has gone up, which is certainly not consistent with their withdrawal.
Whether or not Saddam intends to strike first, the Iraqi military shows every sign of preparing to fight, putting its air defenses on alert, making 11th-hour additions to the fortifications in Kuwait. U.S. forces, which now total 415,000, have gone on a higher state of alert. With one carrier, the Midway, already in the Persian Gulf, the Navy sent in a second, the Ranger, bringing more warplanes in closer range of their targets. 4 more U.S. carriers are in the Red Sea. The Pentagon itself has gone to what it calls threat condition alpha, which involves turning away tourists and in some cases posting armed guards outside offices.
To give you some idea of the level of tension here, Dan, there were 3 separate bomb scares in the building today.
David Martin at the Pentagon. Saddam Hussein put up a fierce front today as the deadline approached. Iraq's army newspaper warned that U.S. forces will walk into, quote, a furnace of hell if they launch a war. The Iraqi government ordered the people of Baghdad into the streets to put on a show of fearlessness. CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi is in Baghdad.
The day of challenge was ordered to spit Iraqi defiance in America's face. Thousands of people took to the streets of Baghdad for an hour this morning in orchestrated demonstrations designed to send Saddam Hussein's message to Washington, that Iraqis are willing to fight and to die rather than give up Kuwait. The marchers did what they were supposed to do. They learned to do it in kindergarten. But the ticking of the clock towards the deadline for war has brought true feelings closer to the surface.
I'm afraid. No. Afraid because blood. No.
And then the answer she was supposed to give.
I love Saddam Hussein.
Saddam was there in every kind of pose. Posters showed him a soldier, man of the desert, statesman, and father figure. But in a graphic illustration of how isolated Iraq has become, there were less than half a dozen pictures of Iraq's remaining friends. Some said neither that nor the enormous military force confronting Iraq mattered.
Yes, we know that, but also we feel that we are strong with our people. And also we are in our country and on our land.
These people may not know much about what they really face in a war with the U.S. and its allies, but this is all they can do about it. There's no such thing as an anti-war movement here unless the government decides there is. And peace is not part of Saddam Hussein's game plan today.
We are fully...
The streets were almost deserted as people stayed home to prepare as best they can. All those with no choice can do is pin their hopes on the God that both sides claim is on their side. When Iraqis next see this sun, the hour for reason and peace will have gone. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Baghdad.
A raid against the forces of Saddam Hussein or hundreds of thousands of U.S. servicemen and women and their other allies in and around the Persian Gulf, the British, the French, the Egyptians. Bob Simon is with American forces in Saudi Arabia on the line hours before the deadline in the desert.
Clear the P! This did not look like a strike force that planned to pause very long. Throughout the American camp, it was a day of last-minute lifting, loading, and checking. Out of the haze of a pale winter light, 3rd Marine Air Wing Hornets, approaching time to pull those ribbons off the missiles.
And the emotions come up and down with as a tide.
At sea, it was a damp and dismal day, a driving rain as supplies were loaded under the big guns of the old war-worn battleship Wisconsin. Victory at Sea, the remake. But to achieve victory, the Americans will have to liberate Kuwait, defeat the Iraqi army, do it quickly, do it with minimal American casualties, with minimal Arab civilian casualties as well. Saddam Hussein cannot defeat this massive military machine, and he does not have to win the war. In Arab terms, all the Iraqi leader needs to do is survive. If he can withstand a week or two of an Allied offensive, he can declare victory without having won a single battle. In Arab terms, it's been done before. In 1982, the PLO, beaten and kicked out of Beirut, celebrated victory. They had stood up to the Israelis. They had won.
There's never been a Western power confronting a local leader in the Middle East which ended in a military victory for the West.
Saddam Hussein, the defiant leader of this armored intifada, needs no more than to go a few rounds with the Americans, and while attention is riveted on precisely when the war will begin, the far more crucial question is when it will end. Bob Simon, CBS News, Saudi Arabia.
Baghdad Radio says Saddam Hussein visited his troops in Kuwait tonight to prepare them for battle. Contrary to many people's expectations, the Iraqi leader has shown no signs of wanting to veer away as the deadline approached. Correspondent Mark Phillips has a report on speculation about what might be going on in the mind of Saddam.
A sobering thought has been reached by many of those trying to read Saddam Hussein's mind, that he may well have concluded he has less to lose by fighting, even by fighting and losing, than he has by simply giving up now.
The more you think about it, the more likely it is that he's calculated